Hello, welcome to Pragim Technologies. I am Venkat. This is part 68 of ASP.NET video series. In this session, we'll discuss about a real-time example where we can use application state variables. Before continuing with the session, I strongly recommend to watch parts 65, 66, and 67 of this video series. Now, application state variables are global and all sessions have access to them. So these variables can be used to track the number of users online. You might have seen many applications where, when you log in, they show a message showing, stating number of users online at this time is so many. Let's see how to exactly do the same thing using application state variables. Okay, let's flip to Visual Studio. Now, the first thing that we have to know is, whenever a new session starts, in the sense whenever a new user logs into our application or connects to our application, we have to detect that. And how do we detect that? In global.asax file, we have application level events. And then among those events, we have something called session_start. So this is the event handler for session start. Whenever a new user connects to your application, a new session ID is assigned to that user. So that's when this session start event is fired, and we have the event handler here. So this event handler can be used to tap into that event. So every time this event happens, we increase the number of users online by 1. Okay, and then similarly, whenever the session expires, we have session_end event. This gets fired. Okay, the user session can end for two reasons. One, they might have logged out, or number two, basically they have their session has expired. They might be inactive for the session timeout. We know that we can specify the timeout for the session in web.config file. The default is 20 minutes. So when this time is reached, and if the user is inactive for that duration, the session will be automatically timed out. So that's when a session can end. And when the session ends, this event is going to be fired, and in this event handler will decrement the number of users online by 1. And application, we are going to use application state variables. So obviously, every session can modify those variables. Okay, and then you can use that application variable in any of the web forms within your application. Let's say, for example, whenever when web form 1 loads, I want to find out how many users are online. I can just retrieve that variable value from application state. Okay, so let's see how to do that. So let's go to global.asax. Within global.asax, the first thing I have to do is I have to initialize the application state variable. So where do I do that? We can do that in application start event. So when does this application start event gets fired? Now, if your application is not already running, obviously your applications will not have any users. So when the first request comes, that's when the application's assembly will be loaded into the memory, and then the application starts up. That's when the application start event is fired. So when the application starts up, I want to create an application level variable. So application, and I'm going to call this users online. Okay, and I'm going to initialize that to 0. Okay, so this will be executed only once, the first time your application starts. And this variable is going to stay in the web server memory until the worker process restarts. The process that's hosting the application restarts. Okay, now whenever a session starts, I want to increment this value by 1. Okay, and to do that, you can simply increment that value by 1. So application of users online is equal to applications of users online plus 1. But then application of users online, you can store anything into an application variable. So when you try to retrieve a value out of it, it's going to return that as an object. We need to convert that to an integer. We know that application of users online will have an integer in that, a number in that, so it's safe to typecast that to integer. Okay, but then the important thing to keep in mind here is you have to synchronize thread access, because ASP.NET web applications work in a multi-threaded environment, which means multiple threads can try to modify this variable at a given point of time. So we want to ensure only one thread can change this value at any point of time. And how do we do that? Application level application object exposes a method called log. So when a thread calls this method on that object, then only one thread can enter this piece of code here. and modify this variable. If there are multiple requests coming in at the same time, this method is going to ensure that only one thread can enter, change this value, and then once that thread calls the unlock method, that's when another thread can get inside and change the value there. So to synchronize thread access, make sure we call application.lock and application.unlock. In between, the code goes where only one thread can modify that piece of code. Okay, and along the same lines, let's copy that, and whenever the session ends, okay, we want to decrement the value by 1. So application.lock users online is equal to int of users online, and I'm going to decrement that by 1. That's it, we are done. So every time a user connects, this piece of code gets executed, so that gets incremented by 1, and whenever the session ends, it gets decremented by 1. And now I can retrieve this variable anywhere within my application. Let's say, for example, when webform1.aspx loads, I want to display a message. Let's say response.write number of users online is equal to, and then we can say application of users online, and I can convert that to string. That's it. Okay, now let's go ahead and run this. So when I first run this, application underscore start events get fired, in which case the application of users online, that variable will be initialized to 0, and then the session start event gets fired, value increment by 1, and in web form we are trying to retrieve that value and display it, so that's 1. Now if I copy that, open another browser window and paste that here, now look at this, it still says number of users online is equal to 1, and this is a different browser window. No matter how many browser windows you open here, what's going to happen is, since the multiple browser instances share the session ID, we have the session cookie, so the session cookie is now shared by these browser windows, and the same session ID is sent to the server. So the server thinks, okay, it's part of the same session. That's why it's not incrementing the value by 1. Okay, so just to make the web server think we are coming from a different session, what we basically can do is in web.config file, let's set the cookieless mode to true. So we are telling it to use cookieless sessions, so we can change the session ID in the URL. Okay, so let me go ahead and run this once again. So when the page loads now, you should see that the number of online users, cookieless is equal to true, so we have an error there. Let's set it properly. So in web.config file, it should be true. Okay, let's run that now. So we set the cookieless attribute to true, so we get that session ID there. Okay, now if I copy the URL as it is, open another browser window, and then paste that, see, that's the same session ID. So I'm not changing that now. I hit enter. It says number of users online is equal to 1. But then what I'm going to do, I'm going to open another browser window, and I'm going to paste that. But this time, I'm going to delete that session ID. Okay, so if you look at that, I just have localhost, the name of the project, and then webform1. When the request goes to the server, it sees the URL. Okay, there is no session ID in the URL, which means it thinks that this request is coming from another user, and it's going to assign a session ID. So session start event will be fired, and then the session value will be incremented. So when I press this, look at that. Number of users online is 2, because there is another session ID. So now if I refresh this, since the application state variable is modified by this user, now that is going to get incremented by 2, and the same is the case with this window. Okay, now if I open another window, let's copy this, and let's change the session ID once again. So number of users online is 3. It's showing 2 here, but if you refresh that, that should become 3, and same is the case with the other windows, because application state variables are shared by all sessions. They're going to reflect that change. Okay, so we can use application state variables basically to track the number of users online. Okay, so let's refresh that, and it should change that as well. number of users online. Now, we haven't seen how the value gets decremented. Basically, for that, the session should end. If you look at in web.config, currently the session timeout is 20 minutes, which is the default one. But if you are following along with me to experience the session timeout event, what you can do is basically set this to 2 or 3 minutes, fire up the browser, multiple browsers like this, and then if maybe this browser is inactive for that timeout value, the session end event will be fired. At that point, the application of online users will be decremented by 1. You can see that value going up and down depending on whether new sessions are established or if the existing sessions have expired. So basically, we can use application state variables to track the number of users online. So every time a new user connects to your application, we want to increase the number of users by online by 1. Along the same lines, whenever a user session ends, then we need to decrease the number of users online by 1. And we have seen how to do that. We have made use of session underscore start and session underscore end events. And by default, the browser instances share the session cookie to have a new session ID assigned when a new browser instance requests the web form. Set cookieless is equal to true for the session state element in web.config. And we have seen how to do that, and then change the session ID in the URL so that the web server thinks the request is coming from a different user, and a new session ID gets assigned. In that process, the session start event is fired so that the value gets incremented by 1. On this slide, you can find resources for ASP.NET, C# and SQL Server interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.